to protect the body because you need it in the next world. So the reason we have coffins with inside coffins with inside coffins is it's plan A, B, C, D to make sure the mummy survives. Now, this is a natural mummy, right? This is a mummy to which nothing has been done at all. It's pre-dynastic, it's been buried in the sand, and it's still a recognizable human being. Now the reason it's recognizable and mummified naturally is the body is in contact with the hot, dry sand. If you can dehydrate the body, if you can get all the moisture out of the body, it won't decay. Because bacteria need moisture to operate on a body. So as long as the body is dry, it will last forever. Right? Now even in pre-dynastic times, you can see there's some evidence of a belief in life after death. This person was buried in a simple sand pit, but he's got a pot with him, he's got a slate palette, he's got a necklace, and the idea, I think, is that he might need them in the next world. So even at this early stage, they had some belief in life after death. But the problem with a sand pit burial is eventually the sand blows away. The sand blows away, and animals get at the body. So something better had to be done. Now, this mummy, Ramses the Great, is an artificial mummy.
Excuse me. Can you please tell us the dates? Prehistoric, dynastic period.
This is Ramses the Great, roughly 1250 BC, right? It's Ramses the Great. Now, the reason Ramses had to be mummified artificially is that he wasn't buried in a sand pit burial. Once the body is removed from the sand and buried in a tomb, it doesn't dehydrate quickly. The moisture stays in the body and it decays. Right? So you have to go to artificial mummification. Now, the problem for us is that the ancient Egyptians never wrote down how they mummified a body. Right? They never wrote down how they did it. I think it was a trade secret. I believe they didn't want anybody to know. The only mummification we have written down, the details for, is the Apis bull. The Apis bull, we have a papyrus that tells exactly how to mummify the Apis. Why? Because the Apis bull only lives for say 35 years. A bull can live for say 35 years. And if the person who mummified the last Apis is dead, no one will know. So they had to write it down. With people, somebody's always alive, he's mummified, so they don't have to write it down. So we don't have any ancient Egyptian text for how to mummify a human being. We have three main sources if we're going to figure out how they mummified. And that was my research project, to figure out exactly how they mummified. One source, of course, is Herodotus. One source is Herodotus, right? A Greek tourist who was in Egypt about 450 BC, and he was told how they mummified. He didn't see one, but he was told. And he wrote down in his research, and I use the word research because Herodotus called his book that he wrote Researches. But he wrote in Greek, and the Greek word for research is historia. And that's where we get the word history from Herodotus' book about other civilizations, which he called historia. Now, Herodotus said the basics. He knew that they made a slit, they cut in the left side of the body. He said they took out the brain with an iron hook, and he knew something about it, but not the details. But Herodotus is an important source. Another source are the tombs, right? Are the tombs. Now, there are a few tombs of embalmers that we have. Now, as you know, the tombs of the nobles show daily life scenes. And in the tombs of a few embalmers, we have scenes of mummification. Not the physical process of taking out the organs and all the things we know about. No, we don't have that. But we have some scenes of wrapping. And this is one of the tombs. And I want to use this as an example of how we can reconstruct mummification from tomb painting. Now this is a scene, by the way, that is shown in the beautiful Mummification Museum here in Luxor. Right, it's on the wall as you come in on the left. Now, let me show you a couple of things about this scene. When I saw this for the first time, I thought, this is right. It's true. There are certain things about it. If you work with mummies, you know that this is real. This is a picture of an embalmer's workshop and what they're doing. Now, how did I know that? Let me show you. Does anybody know the difference between this illustration from the tomb and the one in the Mummification Museum? There's a difference. The one in the Mummification Museum has something that's perfectly reasonable, but it's wrong. Anybody know? It's on a table. In the Mummification, in the Mummification Museum, it's on a table. It has a board coming across, right? That's not in the tomb. The artist thought it must be on the table, but it's not. It's not. This is the correct way to look at it. Now, why? If you're wrapping, now this is the last stages. They're wrapping, right? Already the physical things have been done. The brain has been taken out. The internal organs have been removed. And now they're wrapping the body. And if you're wrapping a body, if it's on a table, you're going to have to lift it up, put the wrapping under, lift it up, put the wrapping under. You don't want that. This body is on 2 blocks. Boom, boom, and you can just bring the wrapping around and around and around, and it makes it a lot easier. So this was the first thing when I saw this, I said, this is right. So then I wanted to look at the other details, what's going on. Well, I think what's right is that probably priests did it. They have the shaven heads. So they're probably priests. They're not just ordinary, right? They're not just ordinary workers. These are priests. But this is interesting. Right here. What we see are the tools of the embalmers. And this is one that's rarely talked about. Right here. Now, as you all know, the Egyptian perspective isn't the best, right? It's not the best for seeing things when the way they drew it. But let me tell you what this is. It's a ceramic vase. It's a ceramic, like faience. And it's used for pouring resin into the cranium, into the skull, after the brain has been removed. Often they poured resin, hot resin, tree sap, into the cranium to cauterize it, to clean it, right? So what this is now, this is the bowl. The resin goes in here, and this, right here, if you imagine it, 2 soda straws. Imagine 2 straws, 2 drinking straws. And they go into the nostril. So the resin goes through here, drip, 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 in here, into the nostril, and into the cranium. So this is an instrument that's used to introduce resin into the skull, right? That's very interesting. Now here, it's a metal pan with 2 handles. That's to heat the resin, so that when you push it on, put it on to keep the bandages together, you can hold it. And what they're doing here, this is a brush actually. It's not here in the drawing, but he's got a brush. He's brushing the resin on the bandages, right? And they're wrapping them. So it's pretty good. It doesn't show us the details of how they get the brain out, how do they take out the stomach, the liver, the intestines, the kidneys, but it's pretty good, and it gives us clues. Now, another clue for me is, of course, mummies. The best thing you can do is look at mummies and try to figure out what they did, right? And we had many techniques. In the old days, before most of you were born, we used to take mummies apart. We used to do autopsies on mummy, we cut them open and see what happened. Now we have CAT scans, we have MRIs, things like that. But it helps us figure out what they did. But still, even though we have Herodotus telling what they did, we have some tomb representations of mummification, and we have the mummies themselves. There are many things that we don't know how they did it. Now, in the nice introduction, it was mentioned that I wrote a book about Egyptian mummies. When I was doing that book, I tried to imagine, if I were an embalmer, how would I do the mummification? What would I do? And at that point, I realized we don't know how they did it. I had always been taught, we always believed, yeah, we know how they did it. They used natron to dehydrate it, they did this, they did that, they removed the brain through the nose. There was loads of things we don't have an idea about. For example, if the whole idea of mummification is to take all the moisture, all the water out of the body, do you drain the blood? It's a reasonable question, right? I mean, look at a butcher. A butcher does that. Do you want to drain the blood? I had never seen any slits in a mummy that would indicate that they drain the blood. For example, you might go from the carotid artery or the femoral artery, any of the larger arteries. I had never seen anything like that. So I wondered, maybe they didn't drain the blood. Here's another question that nobody ever asks. You all know that the body was covered with natron, right? A salt to dehydrate the body. How much do you need? Right? Nobody asked that question. So there were loads of questions that were unanswered. At that point, as I was writing my book on Egyptian mummies, I realized I didn't know anything. Right? And what I had to do to figure it out was mummify a human cadaver. I was going to take a human corpse, a body, and mummify it in the Egyptian way, and that was the only way I was going to be able to answer my questions. So that's the research I'd like to present tonight, to show you how I mummified a human and what we learned about it. And we learned quite a bit. Now, important to remember though, is that while we're talking about the physical process of mummifying, there's also an important religious aspect, right? Important religious aspect. We have the opening of the mouth ceremony, as this says here, right? The opening of the mouth, or opening the mouth here for the Osiris Energen, right? And that's a religious ritual that had to be performed. Or else, when you resurrected, you wouldn't have breath and be able to speak, right? So the opening of the mouth was crucial. Then you have all of these things. You had to have your Book of the Dead. So when you got to the next world, you'd be able to make the negative plea and say, I didn't do this, I didn't do that, and Osiris would be able to accept you into the next world. So it's not just physical, it's religious, but you have to have both, or you're not going to resurrect. Now, I was making a documentary film about mummies, and I wanted to show what it might have looked like, okay? And this was at my university. These are all students in the theater and drama department, right? There's Anubis there in a mask. I'll tell you about him in a second. But I think the important thing is it's in a tent. It's in a tent, right? Because one of the names of Anubis is he who is in his tent, right? And the reason he's in his tent is because they mummified out of doors because of the smells, right? You want it out of doors. You don't want it in a room like this because it's going to smell after a while if you do a mummification after mummification. So he who is in his tent is a clue. It took place out of doors. Another clue, one of Anubis' other names is he who is upon his hill, right? They did it high up on a hill to take the breezes. The breezes will take the smells away. So we wanted to show what an embalmer's workshop might have looked like, okay? And at this point, you want them on the table, right? At this point, you want them on the table. Let me say something about Anubis also. You know, jackals are associated with the dead. Not every jackal-headed god is Anubis, right? We have lots of other gods who are jackals who are not Anubis. For example, Wep-Wawet. Wep-Wawet is the opener of the ways, right? Wep, opener, Wawet, ways. He guides the deceased to the next world, right? So that's a jackal, right? We have Tuambatef. One of the four sons of Horus is a jackal-headed god, and he protects the internal organs. Now, the reason jackals are associated with death is that jackals have a special digestive system. They can't digest fresh meat. They need rotten meat, pre-digested protein. So they prowl cemeteries. So the jackals were seen in cemeteries, and they became associated with the dead. That's why Saqqara is called Saqqara, because it's a place of Sokar, the jackal god in the north. Right? So jackals are associated. So that's why we have a priest here with a jackal-headed mask. He's Anubis here because he's doing mummification, and Anubis is for mummification specifically. Now, there we are. Now, it's interesting, this student here of mine, this student in the drama department, the reason he's wearing the mask is that he was going to be in another play in the summer, and he couldn't shave his head. Right? So we put the mask on him so he could keep his hair. But that's why we have him there. Now, my research begins here. The Wadi Natrum, right? I was going to do everything the Egyptian way. And this is the Wadi Natrum, which is about 50 kilometers out of Cairo, near the monasteries, right? The monasteries in Wadi Natrum. And I wanted to go to the same place that the ancient embalmers went to dig their natron, right? So I'm getting my natron exactly where they got their natron. The white here is the natron. The natron is in the soil. It's in the soil. Now, natron is a chemical compound. It's sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride. It's basically baking soda and table salt. And I went here to get my natron just where they got it. It's in the soil, but when the water table rises, it goes into solution. It's in the water. then when the water recedes, you're left with natron on the side. So I went here to the Wadi Natron, and I'm going to get my natron, right? Now, this is me 14 years ago when the project first began, right? I have more hair and it's a different color, right? But I'm just taking a little bit of natron, because I want to analyze it back at my chemistry laboratory in the university and make sure it's the right stuff. It was the right stuff, right? Now, how much natron did I bring back? 600 pounds. 600 pounds is needed for a human mummification. Now think about that. Think about how expensive it was to get natron for a human mummification. Now 600 pounds is going to come by donkey from the Wadi Natron, right? We're not on the Nile. It's going to come from the Wadi Natron to wherever they're bringing it, and then they ship it. This was only for the very wealthy, this kind of treatment, right? It's not for the average ancient Egyptian, but we're getting natron. Next, I need tools. I want the same tools the ancient Egyptians used. Herodotus tells us, our Greek tourist from 450 BC, he said they used a sharp Ethiopian stone, right? Now, sharp Ethiopian. Now, Ethiopian in those days did not mean the country, right? It means literally burnt face. Ethiopia means a burnt face. And this is where the black people were, right? In the south, sub-Saharan Africa. And an Ethiopian stone is black. It's obsidian, volcanic glass, right? Volcanic glass. Now, when I wrote my book on Egyptian mummies, I said they had knives. This must have been used for ritual purposes. I was wrong. I'll explain. But we found somebody who could make obsidian blades for us. They flake them, right? Now, this is an example of what he did from an obsidian core. We didn't use this. This is just fancy to show what he could do. This is what we used. If you chip from a core a single flake of obsidian, you will have a knife that is sharper than any surgeon's scalpel. This blade here, which I used for the mummification, is 1/4 the thickness of surgical steel scalpels. It's much sharper. You can't see it unless you look at a microscope, but when you use a surgical steel scalpel, you're actually tearing the body a little bit. It's not a beautiful clean cut. It's not under a microscope. This is. This was better than any surgical scalpels I've ever used. So I almost had to relearn surgical technique because I'm used to scalpels, and this was much sharper. I had to be very careful. So we had our obsidian blade, just like Herodotus told us they used. Now this is famous. Okay, I got to tell you about this. We have a couple of them in our museum here, in the Mummification Museum. Everybody thought that this was the knife the embalmer used. Now, why? The answer is simple and reasonable. When you make the cut over here, it's only about 3 inches. It's only about 3 inches. It's small. You can't get both hands in. You're working with one hand and kind of in the dark. It's not easy. And how do you cut it? And the idea was this notch here, right here. Perhaps it hooks on the organ, the stomach, the liver, the intestine, and you pull it and it cuts it. It's a good idea. It's wrong. Doesn't work. We tried to use this knife. Now we made knives that were also bronze and copper, just like the Egyptians. They did not work well. What we finally had to use was the obsidian. The obsidian is what they used, and it was the best by far. This is actually a razor. It's not anything to do with mummification. There was even one found in Tutankhamun's tomb, right? So it's not a mummification knife. I'm pretty sure of that. But we all believed it. We all did. And these are the knives we made, right? Copper and bronze, just like the Egyptians. This is another thing we were going to use to pull the organ out, perhaps. You know, you go in and maybe you can pull it out, perhaps. This is the most important. This is the famous hook with which they remove the brain. Now, how'd they do that? First, you have to go in through the nostril, through the nose, and break through a bone that's behind the eyes called the cribriform plate and the ethmoid bone. Ethnoid. It's called ethnoid because it's Greek for the word sieve. You know, when you put flour through and things, a sieve, because it's honeycombed. It's thin. So you go through and you break it, right? Now, everybody said, there are many articles written about this, that what you do is you take this instrument, now that you've broken through, you take the instrument, you put it through the nostril, Cadaver's lying down here, and you pull out the brain a little piece at a time. Right? We tried that. It does not work. You cannot pull the brain out through the nose that way because the brain is not solid enough. It doesn't stick to the hook. It doesn't work at all. What we finally figured out was, we broke through the ethmoid bone. We put this in. What we did was, we turned it around and around, liquefied the brain. We liquefied the brain, made it like a smoothie, right, in the hotels. And then we turned the cadaver upside down, and the brain ran out. That's how they did it. And that's, of course, why we never find any brains in tombs, right? It's just liquid, it goes out, and they throw it out. Now, the other thing, of course, is you all know, the ancient Egyptians believed that you thought with your heart. Right? They believed that the heart is what you thought with. Which makes sense, because when you get excited, it's your heart that beats quickly, not your brain. Right? So, they could throw out the brain. They didn't understand the function of the brain. They really didn't. But this is our hook we're going to use. This is what we're going to break through the ethmoid. And I had my students make various bowls, just like Egyptian bowls. This one, as you can see, intestines, right? You with me? Stomach, right here it says so. We have the hieroglyphs on it. My hieroglyph students put everything on. This is natron, right? Then we needed palm wine. Palm wine. Now the reason we needed palm wine is that Herodotus tells us they used wine to wash out, palm wine to wash out the abdominal cavity. Once you take away the internal organs, you can wash out with palm wine. Now the only place we could get palm wine was in Nigeria, right? This is interesting. This is the word for wine, by the way, right here, the hieroglyph for wine. And I think it sounds like what it is. What I mean is, you know, the Egyptians liked words that sounded like they were. For example, everybody knows the word for donkey is e'ah, right? The ancient Egyptian word for donkey is e'ah. The word for cat was me'ah, right? And the word for wine is erp, right? Like a burp, I think. So that was the word for wine. And we got our palm wine from Nigeria. And there it is. And a little pyramid on it. We thought that was good. That was a good sign. It's called Delta. But it's from Nigeria, and it says shake well for full nutritional value. So what we did was we used that to wash out the abdominal cavity. Now, next. Frankincense and myrrh. We know that they used frankincense and myrrh. So I got my frankincense and myrrh at the same place they did, right? Southern Arabia. And this is myrrh on the right, frankincense on the left. That's to help the smells. You know, the body's going to smell. Now, we also know that they used magical bandages. From unwrapping mummies, we see magical bandages. They use magical bandages, and my hieroglyph students did these magical bandages, which are actual things found on bandages. And we had to get linen. You know they use pure linen, right? Now linen is not cotton, right? It's from the flax plant, which is different, right? So we had to get pure white linen, undyed linen, and we found it in Ireland. That's where we got our linen, right? So that's our bandages. We're ready. We have tools. We have the natron, we have the wine, we're almost ready for our mummification. But we need some jars, right? We have the canopic jars. My students made canopic jars. These are our Shakti statues, right? And these are the storage jars for the natron. And these 4 ankhs, the reason we have them is only one embalmer's board has ever been found. I don't mean an embalmer's table with the alabaster, the nice one like in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. I don't mean that. I mean the actual board that they would do a lot of the work on. Only one embalmer's board was ever found, 1922, by Herbert Winlock, who was excavating near Deir el-Bahri. And he found there an embalmer's board, a big board, maybe, I think it's 7 feet by 5.5 feet, right? So at the corners of it, though, were 4 ankhs. Because this was a table of life. You were going to have eternal life there. So at the 4 corners, you have the ankh signs. So we had the ankhs made, and we're going to make the embalmer's board. Here we are, we're making the embalmer's board just like the one Winlock found. We're making it with hand tools, same Egyptian way. And the curious thing is, across the board were 4 very big, you can see them here, 4 very big pieces of wood, lumber, big. And we didn't know why. Right? We didn't understand why. The other thing we didn't understand was, why was the board so big? It didn't have to be 5 feet wide. A body's like this. But we found out when we did it, when we did the mummification, but that's why we do it. Now I'm snapping the board together. Same way the Egyptians, this is the back. the same way the Egyptians did it, with pegs and dowels, no nails. And now we're about to do our mummification. We have our obsidian tools, we have copper, we have bronze, we have all kinds of things. And the nice people with the cameras is National Geographic. There is the nose. Right? We have the mummy, the cadaver is draped like in a surgery room. And there's the nose, and I'm going in with this instrument, and I'm going to tap it with wood, just like they tap chisels with those big mallets, and I'm going to break through the ethmoid bone into the cranium, into the skull, to remove the brain, right? So I'm tap, tap, I'm in. Now, this is going all the way in, and then we're going to turn it around and around and around to liquefy, to make the brain into a liquid, and then we'll turn the body upside down, and it'll run out, which we did. Now, the question is, how do you know when you've got all the brain out? You have to get it all out, or else it'll decay. We wondered about that. How did they know? And what we figured was, they took a strip of linen, and they pushed it in through the nose, into the cranium, and turn it around with the instrument, and you pull it out. It'll come out with blood on it. It'll come out with gray matter, brain. And then you keep repeating it until it comes out perfectly clean. Then you know you've got it all out. So here, we're taking out the linen strip, and it's bloody, it has gray matter on it, but we did it 6 or 7 times, and then it came out perfectly clean. Next, we are about to make the incision on the left side. Right? We're going to make the incision on the left side. Just like in tombs, you know how in the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, they put down the grid in red? On the wall you have the red. They made a mark in red. Somebody came, an anatomy person, came and made the incision mark here, and then the slitter came. A man called the slitter with his obsidian, and he cuts the body. So, that's the size of it. It's 3 inches, a little bit more than 3 inches. And that's all we're going to work with. The reason it's so small is they didn't want to damage the body any more than they had to, because it's going to get up and go again in the next world. You want it to look good. Right? As a matter of fact, Herodotus tells us, when the slitter came, the man to make the incision came, he made the incision, and then they threw stones at him, and he ran away. Now, it's a ritual. They're not trying to hurt him. But the ritual was, he has defiled or hurt a human body, so they throw stones at him. That's wrong, and then he runs away as part of the ritual. So that's our incision. Now I've got that obsidian blade, my knife right there, just that, and I've made one gentle cut through the abdomen, and the yellow you see is the adipose tissue. It's a layer of fat, and then one more, and I'm right into the abdominal cavity, right in. Now we have to remove the internal organs, right? We've got the brain out, now it's time for the internal organs. Now remember, you have 2 cavities in this area. You have your abdominal cavity, then you have a diaphragm for breathing, and up above is your thoracic, right? So you have your lungs, your heart, you got your stomach, liver, all that stuff down below. We're going to take it all out almost. Now, that is the first organ that comes out. One of the things we wanted to learn was, what order did the organs come out in? How did an embalmer get it out? Well, one of the first organs, that's the spleen. Your spleen. Now, and this is where I have to say something about the ancient Egyptians. It's very often said that the ancient Egyptians had a great knowledge of anatomy because they did so many mummifications. Not true. You don't learn anatomy by sticking your hand in a little incision and pulling things out. In medical school, we all have a cadaver where you work on, but you have an abdominal flap. You open it up, you can see where the liver is, oh, there's the stomach, there's the intestines. But pulling things out this way, you don't learn anatomy. Think about it. 4 canopic jars, right? 4. You have a lot more internal organs than that. Everybody always says, stomach, liver, intestine, kidneys, right? What about the gallbladder, the spleen, the pancreas? You have all kinds of good things inside you that they never thought of. There isn't a word for spleen in ancient Egyptian. They didn't know it existed. So they didn't have a good knowledge of anatomy. But that's the spleen. Now I'm working with Ron Wade here. He's my co-worker. He was the director of the State Anatomy Board for Maryland, and he was terrific to work with for several reasons. One reason is he knows more anatomy than I do. The other reason is he's small. He has small hands. And if you're working in a 3-inch incision, if you have big hands like mine, it's not so good. So I did the easy part. I took out things like the stomach, liver, intestines. But the hardest thing to do, I think, was to leave the heart in place. Now remember, they left the heart inside the body, because you will need to think when you get to the next world to say the magical spells to resurrect. So the heart is left in, but the lungs are taken out. It's very hard not to destroy the heart when you're going up to the lungs, because the greater arteries are up there and you got to be really careful. And Ron did that, you know. So that, he really did the hard part. But there we are. We're taking out the intestines over here. And now we're putting the intestines in jars with natron on them. There's the intestines here. We're going to put the stomach in here. That's the stomach. That's the intestines. And we're going to put them in natron, in the dehydrated salts. Okay. We are pouring the salt over our internal organs because we're going to dehydrate them also. Now, we are washing out. Remember, brain is gone, internal organs are gone, even the lungs are gone. I should say something about the kidneys also, by the way. You know, when we study mummies, about half have the kidneys removed and half have the kidneys still in place. Why? It's again, they didn't have a good knowledge of anatomy. If you know your anatomy, your kidneys are in your back, right? They're in the back. And in front of the kidneys is a thick membrane called the peritoneum. Like when you get peritonitis, right? The peritoneum. Now, if you're an embalmer and you're reaching in for a little incision and you're feeling around, you'll feel the peritoneum say, it's nice and smooth, we got it all. But the kidneys are behind, right? So very often I think they didn't know the kidneys were there. So we've got everything and we're washing out the abdominal cavity now with our wine, right, with our palm wine. And now it's time to put our mummy in natron. Now these little packets are natron. We took a little square of linen, put the natron in it, tied it up, and we're going to put it inside the body. We're going to push all the way up to the thoracic, around the heart, where the lungs were, and fill it with these natron packets, including the abdominal cavity. We want to dehydrate from inside as well as outside. So these natron packets are going to absorb water and blood, whatever liquid is in there, body fluids, and they're going to absorb the fluids and help us dehydrate the body as quickly as possible. Now it's time to put our mummy on the embalmer's board. This is when we realized why these very big railroad ties here, these big, big blocks of wood. The reason they're there, and it's very clever, when you die, your heart stops beating. And the only thing that affects the blood, where the blood goes, is gravity, pulling it down. So for example, if there's a murder and the body is put in a closet in the corner, all the blood, if it's standing up, will go to the bottom of the legs, just by gravity. If it's lying down, all the blood will go to the back, right? Your gluteus maxima, your back, and you want natron under the mummy. You want the natron under the mummy, and the reason for these big blocks of wood was to keep lots of natron in place so it doesn't squirt out. So we filled this whole thing with natron, then we put the mummy on. The mummy is now on the table. There's his foot, right? With me. There's the mummy's foot. There are the internal organs, and we are piling our 600 pounds of natron on top of the mummy. Now this tent, we're in a tent, just like Anubis, right? We're in a tent. We have kept this tent at something like the Valley of the Kings during the summer. It's about 112 degrees, and the humidity is 22%, right? That's where we're keeping it at. We are going to leave our mummy in the natron for 35 days. Why? Because there are papyri that say the body was in a place of cleansing for 35 days. So we think the natron is the purification and the dehydration. So we're going to leave it for 35 days and see what happens. We covered it, we closed the door, we walked away for 35 days, and we didn't look. Right? At the end of maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we thought we were okay because we didn't smell it. Right? If it we could have had a rotting cadaver, you know, but we didn't smell it. So we were okay, I think. Now, it's after 35 days and we're removing the natron. There's the feet, it's coming out. And there he is. He looks a little like Ramses the Great, right? Kind of like that, right? We like that. Yeah. There's the mummy's hand, you can see, right? And that's another thing we were wondering about. When does a mummy look like a mummy? Is it after mummification, or is it the result of 3,000 years in the tomb? The answer is after mummification, because our mummy looked like a mummy after 35 days, pretty much. There he is. He's still got the little bit of hair that he had, kind of like Ramses again. That yellow is fats, lipids, it's fats from the body that come out, but he's pretty much a mummy, pretty much. Now we're examining him, right? We're just brushing off the natron. He still looks like he looked before, and those are the internal organs. Right? Now, we noticed when we started examining him after the 35 days that there was maybe a problem. Maybe. We could still feel moisture in the larger muscles. We hadn't gotten all the moisture out. What do? We put him back in the tent for another 3 months, just to see what would happen. Would he decay? Would he dehydrate? Don't know. Now, after 35 days, our mummy weighed, right, in kilos, about 17 kilos, no, 18 kilos, right? Light, because you're mostly water. You're mostly water.
And before?
Before, 90 kilos. Before it was 90 kilos. So he's lost most of the water, and as you all know, you're mostly water. So if you lose it, you lose your weight. You know, many of you have lifted a mummy 22 pounds. An average mummy's 22 pounds. So there's still water a little bit. We put him back for 3.5 months. And then we took him out. No decay. He had lost the rest of his weight. He's about now maybe 14 kilos. Right? Now we're wrapping him. Now, this is what happens. This is kind of interesting. You can see he's very thin. He's emaciated, right? Because he's dehydrated. That's not blood. That's the resin that we use to wrap the body, right? Now he's fully dehydrated. All the water's gone, and we're going to wrap him. We had decided that we would wrap him like Amenhotep III of the 18th dynasty. We're going to do a full royal wrapping for him. And that's when we learned something. We couldn't. The reason we couldn't is the body was totally dehydrated, totally dry, and brittle. We would have broken his arms if we moved it like this. So, what we think is the Egyptian embalmers were really smart. They knew that after 35 days in the place of cleansing, most of the moisture's gone, it won't decay, but there's still enough flexibility that we could have positioned him and wrapped him. That's why they say 35 days. You have to leave a little bit of moisture in so you can position him and wrap him. Okay? So that's one thing we learned. Now, we're about to wrap him permanently, but we had to keep his arms down like this. We couldn't bring them up. And that's how we wrapped him. I'll show you. We're about to wrap him. Hang on. Wrapping. And there he is. Right? He's wrapped as best we could in the 18th dynasty mode. And now we're going to put him in a CAT scanner. Now the reason we CAT scan our mummy is that our mummy is in a sense the model for all ancient mummies. We know exactly what was done to our mummy. I know, for example, that when I removed the brain, I went in bilaterally, both sides. I went in on both sides to remove it. So I know what the ethmoid bone looks like broken open when you go in both sides. I know I did this, I know we did that. So we now have a record of an ancient Egyptian mummy, of everything that's done to it, and when we find an ancient one, a real ancient one, we can compare and see what was done to it. There's our CAT scans. And there he is. Now you can see we left over here, we have the foot open. Right? We have the foot, this part here. I began by saying that this began 14 years ago and it's still going on. Every year we go back to our mummies. We test to see if there are any bacteria in it, any fungus on it. And so far, after 14 years, now 15 years, it's fine. It looks like an ancient Egyptian mummy. There's no decay. It really seems pretty good. And it's used in research around the world. People ask us for tissue samples. We give them tissue samples. So it's really a research tool. We have no intention of burying it. Right? We have no intention of burying it. It's a research tool, and it's available for people to study. Here's the foot, to give you an idea. And this is what it looks like today. Right? It's in its little box here, not an ancient Egyptian coffin, but it's got its 4 canopic jars here, 4 canopic jars, and, you know, we'll just have to wait about 3,000 years to see how it works, right? So thank you. Do you have any questions? I'd be happy to answer whatever questions. Further.
Excuse me, one question I like after the revolution. Because I know the good relationship between you and Dr.